Longtime Democratic strategist James Carville went off on how critics have been talking about President Joe Biden and his decision to stay committed to the U.S. troop withdrawal in Afghanistan. That deadline, of course, is August 31st. And regardless of what's been going on, he has said that he's committed to that. He's going to commit to that date, even though something pretty awful happened recently. There were 2 suicide bombings near the Kabul airport where U.S. officials are frantically trying to evacuate U.S. citizens. And the result of that awful, tragic event was that 13 U.S. service members died, 95 Afghans died, and that's the current death toll, which is likely to rise in coming days. Now, Carville is not interested in some of the way the media has been covering this issue, and more importantly, covering the troop withdrawal under President Biden. Watch.
Well, first of all, there's no elegant way to lose a war. We lost this war 15 years ago. All Joe Biden was doing is telling us what time it is. And the hysterical and stupid coverage of the mainstream press, it's been awful.
Carville's right, which is a statement that I do not utter often. However, the corporate media coverage regarding Biden's troop withdrawal from Afghanistan has been hyperbolic, inaccurate, and of course, full of scaremongering.
And do any of these groups pose a threat to the U.S. homeland as opposed to the threat that they just pose each other within Afghanistan?
Well, intention, yes. The current assessment is that they don't have the capability, but that is the concern over time. And by the way, if you could do so without being under the watchful eye of the U.S., that allows you great capability to threaten people outside the country, including the U.S.
So in other words, no, maybe they don't pose an immediate threat to the United States, but they could in the future, and we need to have boots on the ground to make sure we're keeping an eye on these various groups, terrorist groups. In the case of the suicide bombings, ISIS-K carried them out, and they've taken responsibility for it. I've even seen some segments that try to argue that the Taliban, which is basically enemies with ISIS, is somehow working with ISIS against the United States. I mean, it's just complete and utter nonsense. And in order to get U.S. citizens and Afghan allies out of the country, whether we like it or not, we have to cooperate and work with the Taliban. But that's not what the war profiteers want. And you see that playing out in corporate media all the time. This is why it was so shocking and, I got to admit, refreshing to see retired Admiral Mike Mullen, who strongly supported the invasion in Afghanistan, now turning around and saying, you know what, we made a huge mistake. We should have pulled our troops out much, much sooner. He argued that the United States should have ended the war in Afghanistan shortly after Osama bin Laden was assassinated, I should say, by U.S. forces. Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from October of 2017 till September of 2011, is thus far the only senior officer from that period who has publicly admitted that the U.S. policy and he personally was deeply mistaken. He says it's hard to deny the evidence in front of you. Now, Mullen was pretty candid about the failed Afghanistan war during an interview with ABC's This Week.
I thought we could build the Army and give them a chance to create structures which would run a country in a much more modern fashion. That just is not the case.
So when you look back on those years, are you really kind of beating yourself up over that?
Well, I am, yeah. What I thought we could do, and I advised President Obama accordingly, is I thought we could turn it around. Obviously, I was wrong.
You've also heard President Biden say, look, we should have gotten out 10 years ago. We should have gotten out after they killed Osama bin Laden. You were there when they killed Osama bin Laden.
Sure.
You were the chairman. Should we have gotten out then?
I think in retrospect, yeah, we should have. I don't think it was possible for us to just abruptly walk away right after we killed bin Laden, but clearly we could have gone earlier than we did.
Did the mission fail?
I think complete failure, no. Clearly taking out bin Laden was a huge impact in terms of al-Qaeda and what was represented there. I'm not inclined to just lay it on, yes, it was a success, or or it was a failure. I think we're somewhere in between.
Now, I mostly agree with Admiral Mike Mullen. We certainly should have pulled troops out much, much sooner. However, I would just add that there was really no need for the invasion in the first place, because the fact of the matter is, and this is always missing from news reports, the Bush administration had an opportunity to bring Osama bin Laden to justice at the very beginning. The reporting at the time from ABC News, this is on October 14th, 2001, indicated that the United States rejected yet another offer by Afghanistan's ruling Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden for trial in a third country if the U.S. presents evidence against bin Laden and stops air attacks. But of course, the Bush administration certainly had no interest in alternatives. They wanted to invade Afghanistan, and unfortunately, they did. 20 years and more than $2 trillion later, the war was a complete and utter failure. Now, again, thousands of American service members died. Tens of thousands of Afghan civilians died as a result of this failed war. There is no appetite left in the United States to remain in that country. But despite all of that, you have the media that had aided and abetted the Bush administration continuing to beat war drums. Let's take a look at this next video.
This fight will continue until Kandahar is, in fact, a free city.
This as about 1,000 U.S. Marines reinforce their makeshift forward base outside Kandahar, raising the flags, American and New York City, a gift to commemorate the September 11 terror attacks.
Osama and Saddam are the world's most wanted criminals, yet their personal importance is now being downplayed.
We heard from intelligence sources last week and confirmed by members of Congress who sit on the intelligence committees that indeed intelligence sources have said there is a 100% chance that America could face another terrorist attack as retaliation.
I've seen combat all the way from Laos to the present day, over 3 decades, and I have to say that your unit was very cool under fire. You should be proud of them.
Oh, we are, and we've been proud of them every day since they've been in Afghanistan. They've continued to show themselves as true warriors, true war fighters. From the day one to yesterday, as you've seen that their training has paid off. We've got some great leadership here. They train their soldiers hard, both back at Fort Drum before we came, and even now while we're here, they continue to perform well.
So everywhere you turned, corporate media was in favor of the invasion in Afghanistan. There were no alternative perspectives or points of view. And anyone who was even a little critical of the decision for the Bush administration to invade Afghanistan was brushed off, was mocked. In some cases, careers were destroyed over raising some red flags or some questions about that invasion. And by the time we hit January of 2002, the international community grew concerned about how the United States was detaining prisoners of the Afghanistan war in Guantanamo Bay. In fact, U.S. media coverage was dismissive of the fact that the treatment of these prisoners and Afghan civilians did in fact break international laws.
From what I've seen, I've spent like a month and a half after September 11th in the States, and what I've seen is that American journalists have become more patriotic, can we put it this way, which is not the case for the majority of European, or let's say of Italian journalists. Italy has been quite critical about everything about what was going on. But going back to your first question about the Guantanamo, the detainee story, I think that it's a clear indication for the fact that some trouble between Europe and the United States could come up, because in the past few days there was a lot of criticism coming out from Europe, especially from Great Britain, from Germany, from Spain, asking the United States to apply and to obey by the international law. And as someone told me the other day, that might be, the beginning of the end of the honeymoon between Europe and the United States.
Now, in order for Americans to hear that perspective, they would have to tune in to C-SPAN 2. Not even C-SPAN 1, just C-SPAN 2 to get that perspective. But wall-to-wall coverage on the war in Afghanistan was primarily positive, and it was incredibly difficult to get any critical look at the way we were treating Afghan civilians or detainees in Guantanamo Bay. It was difficult to get anyone who was willing to criticize the potential war crimes that were being committed by the Bush administration, certainly early on in the war. And the US media coverage was, in fact, defensive about any type of criticism. In fact, during that same panel, there was, of course, a member of the US media who tried to defend US coverage and, in turn, defend the war and potential war crimes committed by the Bush administration. Let's take a look at what a member of the US media had to say. This was a columnist for USA Today.
I see myself as a left of center columnist, but among all of God's creatures who I feel sympathy for, the 158 detainees on Guantanamo rank towards the bottom of the list.
Has there been a discrepancy between the U.S. and European media on the specifics of Afghan casualties, and why do you think that might be? Who wants to take that first?
I will lay down the marker for the American view, which the Europeans could now then dissent on.
We're not being aggressive at all, Walter.
I think the first thing why the unintended casualties in Afghanistan has been a secondary or even tertiary story here is because there are always a certain number of unintended casualties in any warfare situation. And I don't think that the abuses in this war in Afghanistan were systematic. I do not think that had one looked closer, one would have anything that would even be in the same definitional framework with a My Lai. I do not think that this is rogue pilots dropping bombs willy-nilly.
Just be dismissive of all of the awful actions that were taken by US forces in this country, and be dismissive of the reason why we entered in the first place. Again, part of the problem is the media didn't really focus much on what the alternatives were. It was as if they just accepted the Bush administration's point of view and decided to go along with what their narrative was. And as I've mentioned in an earlier Decode segment, there are certainly corporate interests at play. There are war profiteers at play that certainly do have influence over the media. And I'll get to more details about that in just a minute. But I do want to also focus on the costs of this war in the form of human lives, because that also seems to be left out of the conversation even today. So the Associated Press reported that in terms of the number of American U.S. service members who have died as a result of this war, 2,448 of them have lost their lives. 3,846 U.S. contractors lost their lives. The Afghan National Military, which no longer exists, of course, lost 66,000 people. The Allied service members also lost their lives, 1,144. But here's the number I want you to focus on. Afghan civilians. More than 47,245 Afghan civilians have died as a result of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, not to mention the 444 aid workers and 72 journalists. Now, I give you those numbers because it's not just about the money, which of course overwhelmingly profits these defense contractors that have a financial interest to engage in these wars in the first place. It's about the lives that are lost and the hostility that is geared toward the United States because of what we do abroad. Oftentimes when there are discussions and debates about whether or not we should accept refugees or why it is that there are these various insurgent groups in the first place, again, what gets left out of the conversation in corporate media is how our actions played a role in the hostility that's directed toward us. It didn't just come out of nowhere. When you're dropping bombs or doing signature drone strikes on weddings and killing entire families, I think you can understand where terrorism or terrorist groups can stem from. But we refuse to take any responsibility for that. And you see it playing out in how these discussions are taking place in corporate media today. Now, Admiral Mullen's admission that the war in Afghanistan failed and that he himself had poor judgment is jarring and candid. It's jarring because it's so candid and honest. And those types of conversations about U.S. foreign policy, again, are non-existent in the American press. In other words, Mullen is the exception, not the rule. In fact, we're witnessing the status quo play out in real time. Basic journalistic ethics are consistently ignored. And the very foreign policy experts who opine on Biden's decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan have massive conflicts of interest that aren't even disclosed to audience and readers. So I bring you to what's happening today in regard to the troop withdrawal and how it's being covered in the press. The Intercept recently provided several recent examples in a piece titled, "Cable News Military Experts Are on the Defense Industry Dole. Many former military and public officials appearing in the news have more than a patriotic interest in a continued occupation." And I was really grateful for this piece because they get into specifics and they name various individuals who get brought on to give their expertise on foreign policy, when in reality, they have these massive conflicts of interest that are never disclosed to the audience. For example, Fox News keeps having on this guy named Jacobin, a general who has a scathing criticism for Biden's decision to go through with the troop withdrawal. Let's watch.
We had a huge intelligence, robust capability that we wanted to keep in place. It's publicly disclosed that we had a significant CIA presence on the ground, whose number one task was to stay focused on the Al-Qaeda. After all, it's from their capability that we went on to kill Osama bin Laden, who was across the border in Pakistan. So that is gone. How do we track and maintain eyes and ears of what is happening with international terrorists, to include the Al-Qaeda, inside of Afghanistan, when we've lost the eyes and ears of our intel community on the ground, when we lost the eyes and ears of the Afghan people, when we lost the eyes and ears of all the Afghan troops that used to be out there reporting what is going on in their neighborhood?
What are we going to do without the eyes and ears in Afghanistan? Oh my God, we should all be afraid. We can't keep an eye on all these terrorist groups. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? It's the fear-mongering messaging that you get over and over from people like Jacobin, who, by the way, is a former board member at weapons maker General Dynamics and is a chair of AM General, the company that makes Humvees. Seems like there's a bit of a conflict of interest there, and maybe the audience deserves to know about that. But of course, Fox News never ever discloses that information to the audience. He also sits on the boards of Kailum Technologies, Inc., which manufactures military chemical lights and other technology deployed on the battlefield in Afghanistan, and the Institute for the Study of War, an awful think tank that publishes defense policy proposals with the aim of, quote, developing the next generation of national security leaders, end quote, and is backed by CACI International, Inc., General Dynamics, and other defense contractors / war profiteers. Now, among the other talking heads that you're likely to see on cable news segments, or you're likely to read from in op-ed pages, without, by the way, disclosing their ties to defense contractors, was retired General David Petraeus, a guy whose judgment was so awful that he was ousted from the Obama administration because he leaked classified materials to his mistress and biographer. But nonetheless, I mean, we live in a country that loves to see men fail upward. And so David Petraeus recently had an interview with the BBC. They wanted to know what his expertise was on the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. And here's what he said. We should literally reverse the decision to withdraw troops. I fear we would come to regret the decision, and we already are. There's no good outcome unless the United States and its allies recognize that we made a serious mistake. And guess what? He repeated similar talking points during an interview with Katie Couric.
What kind of troop presence do you think should have been maintained in Afghanistan to keep things under control?
Well, we had somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 troops on the ground, depending on your counting rules. Again, we had not had a battle loss in some 18 months or so. That's partly attributable to the deal that we did, very unwise deal that we cut with the Taliban during the previous administration. We could have crafted a sustainability being measured in terms of blood and treasure, sustained commitment. By the way, a sustained commitment would be the one that would provide the most solid foundation from which to negotiate. Part of our problem all along for 3 administrations is that we have repeatedly said we want to leave. And then we expect to negotiate with an adversary who realizes we want to leave and is not going to concede anything to us. We got really nothing from the agreement that was signed in the previous administration.
Now, retired General David Petraeus certainly has conflicts of interest of his own because, getting ousted from the Obama administration worked out pretty good for him. Petraeus serves on the board of Optiv Security, a large cybersecurity firm that contracts with the Department of Defense and is a partner at KKR & Co., a global private equity firm with assets in the defense sector. Neither the BBC nor Katie Couric disclose those conflicts of interest because why would they? But I would argue that their audiences, their readers certainly deserve to know this because as these individuals are beating the war drums, I think people deserve to know what their real interests are. What are the influencing factors that fuel the commentary that they're providing in these various outlets? Now, both Keane and Petraeus sit on the board of the Institute for the Study of War, which of course also includes 2 major defense contracting companies. The only real purpose of these think tanks is to lobby politicians and government officials for more war. Its national security fellow recently wrote in a blog that America lost the war in Afghanistan, but it matters that we fought it. No nation on earth has ever done more, get this, to advance the cause of freedom. No people has sacrificed more. Americans should be proud of that fact, even in defeat. The Taliban, which we, of course, went in to fight, now controls Afghanistan completely and has all of that sophisticated weaponry that we had provided to the now defunct Afghan National Army. So how exactly are we spreading freedom? All we do is go in and destabilize countries. We made the Taliban stronger. But they don't want you to know that because, of course, they want more war. And even the founder of the Institute for the Study of War was invited onto Fox News to opine on the war in Afghanistan. Kimberly Kagan is her name. And here's what she said. Nothing shows the value of American force presence like the absence of American forces as we've seen in the past month. In other words, we need to keep boots on the ground forever and ever, permanently. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And again, readers were never informed about her ties to profitable defense contractors. And so-called experts who sit on television panels to discuss Afghanistan are so laughable that The Onion couldn't help but poke fun at them and their clear conflicts of interest. Let's take a look at a screenshot from a recent satirical piece, of course, that they put out. Let's take it to our Afghanistan experts, says anchor, throwing to panel of Dick Cheneys. They really do get it. They get it right. Now, in the end, when we take a step back to process the motivating factors, it all boils down to profit motives, both for the media and for the talking heads featured in the news. The press tends to think that having access to these people gives their broadcasts and their pieces some sort of legitimacy, some sort of credibility, regardless of how horrible the track records of these retired generals happen to be, regardless how many conflicts these members of various think tanks have. And the press also builds these relationships with members of the intelligence community, for instance, with the hope that someone within their agencies will hand them their next scoop. But of course, they tend to forget that the intelligence community has its own interests at play, and maybe they should be skeptical of whatever scoop a member of the intelligence community gives them. But they all end up doing, what they all end up doing is repeating pro-war propaganda that always traces back to lobbying by these war profiteers. It's been a profitable grift for them and devastating for pretty much everyone else, including the taxpayers who fund these wars, the soldiers who have lost their lives in these wars, and of course, those who are fortunate enough to survive come back and are abandoned by our federal government. Now, shareholders for Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics, they actually come up on top. If you purchase $10,000 of stock evenly divided among America's top 5 defense contractors on September 18th of 2001 and faithfully reinvested all dividends, it would now be worth $97,295. This is a far greater return than what was available in the overall stock market over the same period. $10,000 invested in an S&P 500 index fund on September 18th of 2001 would now be worth $61,613. It's just the grift that keeps on giving, and it gives to the wrong people. The shareholders for these defense contractors, the executives for these war profiteers. Corporate media, of course, is also sponsored by the likes of Boeing, which is why they're a little less likely to speak out against wars like that of Afghanistan and Iraq. And as Eric Alderman demonstrated, the correct way to sum up the war in Afghanistan is this. The Biden administration may have screwed up the exit of U.S. troops and the friendly Afghans who helped them. But hey, this was a 20-year, nearly $2.4 trillion war effort that was built on lies and self-delusion, and that we didn't really want to win in the first place. And so there you have it. Here we are today, a failed war. And despite its failures over 2 decades, you still have clowns demanding that we remain in Afghanistan. Nando.
Yeah, I mean, it's been pretty interesting to see. I mean, I think that the media in general has been quite kind to Biden. Branko Marcetic wrote about this in Jacobin, and then as soon as he did this, it was just like they fall into place. Like it's just like blanket hostility towards Biden. I mean, incredibly ridiculous, unfair reporting. Like I sound like Trump, very unfair. But there was like a Politico piece. I don't know if you saw this, where it was like, you know, there was a list of Americans that were like, you know, meant to be taken out, you know, removed, like, you know, given visas or whatever, or, you know, given process to be removed from Afghanistan to get out. And they were like, you know, some like national security sources to Politico were like, this is essentially a kill list for the Taliban, you know. And like every bit of evidence we've seen is that the Taliban's been playing ball with the evacuation, like that they're more or less like they're even like protecting, you know, trying to protect the airport to allow Americans and foreign nationals to get out. So
well, that's the deal, right? That's the deal negotiated. They control Afghanistan, whether we like it or not. And if we want to get U.S. citizens, personnel, Afghan allies out of the country, we have to cooperate. And we have to, that's part of the reason why Biden has been committed to the August 31st date. All the people who were like, you can't do it. No, don't commit to it. We got to stay longer.
The Brits were freaking out about that. In my word, it's August 31st. We're on holiday here in the UK. We haven't put our plans in order to get the people out. You know, like it's just I hate them.
And the Taliban's like, no, we want you guys out by August 31st. Like if Biden just unilaterally decided, like, no, we're going to stay longer. Taliban's not playing ball anymore, and that creates more of an unsafe situation on the ground.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.